Now, that necessitates an activist kind of mindset because you got to change the world into something that you want to see. But how do you know you're changing something for the better if you don't understand it first, right? Um, and so that's kind of what I wanted to get into just really briefly. So, as part of the Fiedler on the Roof saga, there was one of the commentary articles that was published here on Safe Science, on the Substack on Safe Science, Legis Substack. Which, if you aren't part of it, you're not a paying member. I encourage you to be part of it. Here, this is outside the paywall, so you can certainly see this. And in this case, I thank for that because I think this is a great piece to read, not just to think about the whole saga of Fiedler on the Roof, but also in general about a point that I think bears a little bit of perhaps thinking about in a way that one could generalize the idea. There's a lot of concerns about having activism be creeping more and more into science, particularly with the influence of postmodern thought, which breeds a lot of activism, to be frank. And so this article was really, really fascinating to me when I read it. It's written by Bernard Hommel, and it was one of the articles involved in the Fiedler on the Roof saga, or the Fiedler on the Roof fiasco. And it's certainly worth a careful read. And one of the reasons I want to get into it, dealing with diversity in psychology, science, or ideology, is to get at what he's talking about with respect to activist thinking and some of the things about diversity that we forget. And then also, let's go at it a little bit in that build from Hommel's thought, because this is psychology and talking about the topic of diversity, but perhaps a little bit more generalization of activist thinking. So, the abstract here. The increasing use of political activist arguments and reasoning in scientific communication about diversity is criticized. Based on an article by Roberts, Berket-Chevet, Dollins, Goldie, and Mortensen 2020 on racial inequality in psychological research, 3 hallmarks of activist thinking are described. 1. Blindness to the multidimensional nature of diversity. 2. The failure to distinguish psychological mechanisms with the impact of moderators. And 3. A blindness to agency as an explanation for psychological observations. So, this is, he's broken it up nicely, and it's actually not a super long article in here, so I do want to bring this up a little bit. So, blindness to the multidimensional nature of diversity. Activist groups commonly focus on the one personal feature their members share, such as gender, sex, race, or sexual orientation, and try to attract societal attention to it. That seems effective and understandable, the more so as the individual might be involved in different activist groups to attract societal attention to other possible features whenever needed. But if the same happens in science, justification is due. It is true that scientific research is always necessarily selective, and so one can always wonder whether that selectivity matters and perhaps limits possible theoretical insights and conclusions. But people, including potential participants in psychological studies, differ with respect to hundreds, if not thousands, of features. Many of them have been demonstrated to affect human cognition and behavior. Sex, gender, race, culture, religion, socioeconomic background, political orientation, intelligence, motivational structure and needs, learning history, upbringing, educational style, experience, personality and traits, body size, body weight, handedness, various kinds of disabilities, cognitive styles, to name just a few. This is a very small list. If you want another place to look at some of these kinds of things, not when you're talking about psychological, but in some of the things going on in society more generally, Thomas Sowell's Discrimination and Disparities goes through a huge, long list of things that are not race, not sex, and not discrimination in the sense of the negative discrimination, what Thomas Sowell called in the book Discrimination 2. It would be well worth reading that if you're going to be doing it. If you're going to be doing anything research-wise with diversity, or if you're just going to be having to deal with this stuff in general, I really strongly recommend Thomas Sowell's book, Discrimination and Disparities, because a lot of the singular fallacies of presuming any disparity between a group is the result of discrimination is ripped to shreds by Thomas Sowell. Man is brilliant. Um, some of them are likely to be interrelated in complex ways, such as race, economic background, culture, country. Racial differences correlate with economic differences in some country more than others, while others may operate independently. Now, statistically, there's a name for this. Let's say you're trying to make a prediction about something, and you've got a huge number of different predictors that you might use. One of the things you have to look for and be careful for is something called multicollinearity, which is to say your predictors have really strong relationships with each other, potentially. If they do, that actually lessens the significance of your findings. And it's something you have to account for statistically. That is a way to think of the problem that Hommel brings up here, statistically speaking. Accordingly, it is important to consider the possibility that some of these features or their interrelations affect behavior in a way that is of theoretical relevance, perhaps even to a degree that would call for an adjustment or an extension of theoretical models. What has been done in many studies, even though the type of features seem to underlie some seasonal changes, if not fashions, such as great interest in societal background in the 1960s, the increasing interest in gender and sex in the 1970s, and the increasing interest in ecological conditions in the 1980s, with a strong emphasis on race since the 2010s. One could always do more, so that it makes sense to keep emphasizing further variables that might be interesting to study. But this is not what Roberts et al. Advocate. They instead focus on a singular feature, race. They report data showing that this feature has rarely been addressed in developmental and social psychology, and almost neglected in cognitive psychology. That most publications were edited by white editors, that most publications were highlighting race were authored by white scientists, and that these employed fewer participants of color. It must be said that most of these findings are trivial, given that the authors only consider journals from North American or European publishers, with authors mainly stemming from North America and Europe. The observed percentage of black editors and editorial board members either corresponded to a percentage of black citizens in these areas, or in the case of board members, overrepresented black scientists. Moreover, given that white authors are more likely to come from countries with a very small percentage of black citizens, less than 1% in Germany and 1.3% in Europe, it is not overly surprising that black participants are rare in their studies. And yet, the authors conclude that strong efforts need to be made in order to increase racial diversity in editing, writing, and participation, so to achieve a more representative distribution of race with respect to editorial positions, reviewers, authors, and participants. It is not so much the unfounded nature of this request, given that the distribution is representative already, that concerns me here, but the fact that the call for diversity was restricted to just one of more than 100 possible personal features of already demonstrated psychological relevance. If we are to report the race of editors, reviewers, authors, and participants, as Roberts et al. Demand, should we not also report their cultural, religious, and economic background, their political orientation, intelligence, motivational structures, needs, learning history, experience, personality, and traits, their body size, handedness, disabilities, and cognitive style? If not, why not? What is so special about race that does not apply to any of these other features? And if race is a social construct, as Roberts et al. Assume, how can they be sure that this construct is comparable across cultures? How do we know that, say, a black individual raised in the US is more similar to a black individual raised in South Africa, Brazil, and China, say, than a white individual raised in the US? Is there any evidence supporting this assumption? I'm afraid that a closer look does not leave any scientific justification for the exclusive focus on race. Now, this is, I think, very well written commentary on that particular aspect, in that it's a critique that is not just applicable with respect to the study that Hommel was talking about. It is a critique that is entirely applicable with respect to sort of DEI initiatives more broadly, to begin with, because they focus on one or a very, very few, maybe 5 or 6, of the things that Hommel here describes. With respect to just DEI initiatives, they're very, very narrow. They're very myopic and what have you. But this kind of narrowness and myopic thinking is not necessarily restricted to just a single discipline or to a single issue. Put it that way. The blindness to other reasons, the willful blindness in some cases with activist approaches, is it's a hallmark of activist thinking when you're just willfully blind to any other possible outcome that could be. Now, I will say I read the Roberts article, and it was very much, you saw me bring it up actually in Side Chat Saturday here, and if I can, I'll try and bring it up really quickly. Hold that thought a second. So yeah, this is the actual article in question that Hommel was specifically criticizing. And I brought this up again, as I said, in Side Chat Saturday. And one of the reasons I brought it up is it, I think, is a prime example of, unfortunately, just activist thinking, because the entirety of the focus is just on race. In here, to begin with, there's a blindness to other options here. And one of the things that struck me as I read this article is, usually you'll have some kind of section that has caveats, which is to say, these are the limitations of what we did. Things that limit the interpretation of results in particular ways. And it's a noticeable thing that I did not see anywhere the authors of this particular study describe any of the limitations that Hommel suggested here. And had they done that, I would have had a lot more respect for this particular article. But it was just utterly ignored. And because this is the closing remarks, actually, and this is where they actually did get into some limitations. First, we examined publications from 2 top-tier journals within each area, although these journals were not representative of all journals. Future research is needed with other journals, both general and area-specific. Second, we focused our analysis on psychology journals, but future research could consider diversity among funding agencies. To truly diversify psychological science, it is important for funding agencies to consist of diverse review panels, to support researchers of color, and to fund projects with diverse samples. Third, our interest was in psychological research that highlighted the important role of race in thinking, development, and behavior. Although many of the core issues tackled here extend to other social groups as well, including but not limited to those based on gender, sexual orientation, religion, class, and political orientation. Okay, so actually, I will give them that. It is actually quasi-present here that they made that statement. I can appreciate that. That is a caveat that makes sense to stick in there. That said, it's so myopic and never anywhere else considers it. It feels almost like an afterthought to me when it was thrown in here. It's so focused on just this one thing, and never includes, for an instance, what other things could be involved. Never even, for an instance, mentions anywhere other than here. I don't think, anyway. I could be wrong because it's been a little bit since I've read it, so don't take me for that. But that's the kind of thing that I want to mention in here, is that in a lot of ways, one of the problems with this sort of activist thinking just generally is a willful blindness to other ways of thinking about it. And that doesn't behoove scientific work very well, because the goal, the purpose of science is the pursuit of the truth. It is more suited to what we know well from something called participatory-based action research, where the goal of said participatory-based action research is to understand the world by changing it. Now, that necessitates an activist kind of mindset, because you got to change the world into something. that you want to see. But how do you know you're changing something for the better if you don't understand it first, right? Um, and so that's kind of what I wanted to get into just really briefly. And I like this particular commentary here with the blindness to the multidimensional nature of diversity specifically. And I will let you all go on into the other stuff here. But with the particular conclusions I want to make. Here, I will read Hommel's conclusion with this. And like I said, I'm leaving this brief, so I encourage you to go take a look at this. It's available on the Unsafe Science Substack. It is important for science to be responsible and responsive to societal needs and developments. Therefore, studying political activism can be useful as being stimulated by it and by addressing questions that political activists are raising. And yet, uncritically accepting activist claims, demands, and reasoning and translating them into scientific practice creates a potentially toxic mix of science and ideology that is likely to damage scientific freedom and independence. Exactly. That is the kind of point I would take with this. Not just with the issue with diversity here as talked about by Hommel, but just in general. That kind of, and particularly with that blindness to other things going on. In this case, blindness to a multidimensional nature of diversity that is far more than just 3 or 4 things that are listed there. And you really should get into that with a lot more depth and a lot more careful nuance because a lot of them are really strongly related. One could say there's a certain amount of multicollinearity that's present when you're talking about these kinds of things. That's it for now. Hit the like button on the way out the door if you like this video. Comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious, everybody.